Oh dear heart, brace yourself gently, for your alarm clock would not save you in Edwardian England. As a servant girl in a grand household around the year 1906, your day would begin not with birdsong, nor with a calm stretch under warm blankets, but with a clang. A bell, in fact. Not metaphorical, not poetic. Simply one of at least a dozen small brass bells attached to a complicated bundle of wires rigged through the manor. Each bell corresponded to a specific room and a very specific person with very specific complaints. You would not wake because you were rested. You would wake because Mrs. Balfour in room 3 has decided she'd like her fire poked. Not relit. It is already lit. She just desires a more artistically arranged flame. Mrs. Balfour is an aesthete, you see. So up you go, long before the sun has considered rising. No time to dabble in getting dressed. Just throw on your uniform. A plain, sensible dress, a starched apron, and shoes that could almost give wooden clogs a run for their money on the pain scale. Hair pinned up, no wisp allowed to stage a rebellion. And hands already chapped from yesterday's endless exposure to lye soap and scalding water. And now, down the back stairs we go. By the time the family upstairs considers fluttering a lazy eye toward consciousness, you've already blacked over 12 grates. That's a charming way of saying you've cleaned fireplaces, swept half a dozen corridors, hauled at least 3 buckets of coal, and lit a parade of fires. You are a morning ninja with an ash-smeared face and the elegance of a silent tornado. But it's time for breakfast. Not yours, mind you. That comes later, if you're lucky. First comes the business of preparing breakfast for his lordship, her ladyship, their collection of vaguely threatening children, any visiting colonels, maiden aunts, or rogue vicars. These people love boiled eggs lined up like infantry and toast that must never, never show a hint of scorching. Butter must be cold, but not firm. Tea must be poured 3 seconds before it is requested, in anticipation of their poorly veiled whims. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mrs. Witherington the cook reigns supreme with a ladle like a scepter, and the ability to flay a scullery maid with only a glance. She's 40, though she claims 30, and has pickled her sense of humour in sherry. Watch your elbows. Now, you might think a bell system would be a marvel of civilized communication. A gentle ding announcing a dignified request. Oh no, it is the equivalent of electronic harassment. The bell rings, and it rings, and it rings again, because you've dared to finish stirring the porridge before sprinting to answer it. Upstairs, Lady Entwistle requires assistance adjusting the rose on her lapel. She has a mirror, 2 hands, and yet still, you must climb 4 flights of stairs to nudge the angle 2 degrees to the left. She narrows her eyes. Too far. Do it again. It is 8:47 a.m. Please remember that. You might assume being a servant afforded some camaraderie, and at times it did. Late at night, whispering over stolen crusts with the other maids, all of you achingly young, painfully tired. You'd mumble secrets and stifle laughter at the butler's suspiciously well-polished moustache. But for the most part, your world was dictated by a hierarchy so rigid it could have been designed by engineers. You were not just a servant. You were a second housemaid, distinct from the first housemaid. One of you dusts candelabras in the green drawing room. The other does not dare set foot in there unless the first has fainted clean away, and the butler has verified it with a smelling salt certificate. And even in this tightly wound world of etiquette and discipline, the unexpected still drifted through, like when the family's pet parrot escaped and landed in the luncheon meat, or when Lord Entwistle drunkenly mistook you for a potted palm and apologised to you twice for shedding on the floor. At least he apologised. That's rare. In any case, you've now been awake for several hours. Your limbs ache. Your spirit is sustained purely by occasional sips of lukewarm tea, and you've achieved what the family upstairs will refer to as a very neat morning, delightful. They'll never know the soot you brushed from their porcelain hearthbrush by hand. They'll never know your name. Mostly, they'll know that the toast was not burned today. And isn't that just lovely? If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, just rest now, because in a moment, the real chaos begins. Adjustments must be made, corsets must be wrangled, and you, dear girl, must learn how to serve tea with dignity and hopefully without tripping over the dog. Morning in an Edwardian townhouse arrived not with birdsong or a gentle application of sunshine across crisp linen sheets, but with a thundering, merciless bell. Not one bell, oh no, several, all ringing with the sort of mechanical cheer that implies some lord or lady upstairs cannot possibly endure another moment without their boiled egg, or worse, their footstool. If you were a servant girl in 1906, this discordant chime was your daily starter pistol. Forget yoga or mindfulness. Your first conscious thought was usually something along the lines of, "Dear heavens, not Lord Seymour's second cravat again." You would have been up officially by 5:30 a.m., but unofficially earlier. You see, the scullery maid, the poor soul lowest on the household ladder, had to wake even before that to kindle the kitchen fires, scrub last night's dishes, and give the floor a good sweep with a broom that, by modern ergonomic standards, could double as a medieval punishment device. At the top of the hierarchy, you had the housekeeper, a woman of seemingly infinite keys and a stare that could curdle milk at 20 paces. Somewhere below her on this polite but absolute pyramid, you dwelled, dancing nimbly between duties, soot, and perilous encounters with the cook, who had no patience for chatting girls or overturned sugar jars. Your day may have begun with something deceptively quaint, polishing boots. Sounds charming, yes. Take your mind off your troubles by caressing leather with paste and tiny brushes. Except you had to polish between 8 and 14 pairs before breakfast service, and one wrong scuff on Lord Seymour's patent leathers. Expect a lecture on presentation and British virtue from the butler, who himself smelled a bit like brandy and quiet humiliation. Now, let us pause and take a soft, sympathetic breath for the Edwardian breakfast shift. Because, dear listener, breakfast was not a bowl of cereal and a hope. No, it involved eggs, multiple types, kippers, sausages, bacon, toast laboriously toasted over an open flame, while fending off a smoke-induced coughing fit, and a teapot ceremonially warmed precisely 3 minutes before the tea was introduced. The upper-class digestive system in Edwardian England required more ceremony than a coronation. But before all that even happened, the drawing rooms needed dusting, the eiderdowns needed puffing, multiple fireplaces demanded careful coaxing into life with coal scuttles that left black streaks across your apron and sole, and goodness help you if the master's morning newspaper had even the faintest wrinkle, because apparently paper crinkles were a sign of moral decay. And while we're on the subject of clothing, you didn't just lay out the lady's outfit. You practically orchestrated a textile symphony. Corsets required lacing to a tension well suited to fastening spacesuits. Petticoats must be fluffed. An array of hatpins, gloves, and lace jabots had to be neatly presented like offerings to a rather fashion-obsessed deity. This deity, mind you, might change her mind halfway through and demand something peach, not puce, just as you were triumphantly inserting the final pin. Now, let us not gloss over the food bells that rang incessantly across the house. There was no such thing as time off. You might be quietly peeling potatoes, or rather, dreaming of one day reaching that sweet promotion that allowed you to supervise potato peeling, when suddenly, ding ding ding. Which bell was it? Drawing room? The music room? The suspiciously named morning room, where nothing productive ever occurred. Each bell had its own little number and location label, which meant part of your job was learning to decode domestic Morse code. And yes, meals for the family were elaborate affairs, served in multiple courses by candlelight or thick Edwardian sunshine. But down in the servants' hall, you were lucky if you got a decent cup of tea. That is, if the footman hadn't pinched all the good biscuits again, which, let's be honest, he usually had. Charming smile, yes. Sticky fingers, definitely. By late morning, your apron was already hosting a confetti of ash, flour, and mysterious fuzz from the broom closet, and you were only just getting warmed up. Next came the linen folding, or the choreography of the linen closet, as you might call it, if you were trying to stay upbeat about its crushing repetition. Napkins folded like roses, hand towels folded like very polite pastries, and all scented faintly with lavender, as if that masked the ache in your knees and the longing for a minute's peace. But quiet wasn't given generously to servant girls. You took it in sips, the quiet between bells, a soft breeze through the scullery window, the moment the house seemed to exhale, and the only sound was the gentle ticking of the long case clock in the corridor. And so, wrapped in the hum of silver polish and puffed up sofa cushions, we slipped nearer toward the hush of the early afternoon, when mail is sorted, letters fetched, and Lady Drusilla's pug needs walking. Yes, the one with the bejeweled collar and the rather territorial attitude toward hedges. But that's a story for another sleepy step onward, into the cobbled calm of an Edwardian afternoon. There is a special kind of silence that lives in the early hours before dawn, the sort that wraps around you like a shawl, woven of fog and forgotten dreams. For the Edwardian servant girl, this silence was not a gentle friend, but a punctual enemy, broken by a bell, a boot step, or most often, the unrelenting gurgle of the scullery sink. You see, life below stairs began long before the gentry upstairs so much as twitched a velvet eyelash. A respectable Edwardian household ran on rigid routine, and that routine required someone to tiptoe into freezing kitchens before the sun had even yawned. That someone, usually named Grace, Ivy, or Ethel, would light the kitchen stove, a duty that required more diplomatic finesse than Parliament and more kindling than one could carry without regrettable splinters. Matches were precious, the flint less cooperative than a cat in a bath. And if the range didn't catch by 6 o'clock, breakfast for the entire household might be delayed, an error ranking somewhere between failing to curtsy properly and accidentally sitting in a lady's chair. The horror. With the fire finally lit and stubbornly smouldering like a sleepy dragon, our beleaguered heroine had mere minutes before the real indecencies began. Black leading the stove, a poetic name for a rather dismal task. This meant smearing soot-black paste over every haunted crevice of the iron beast and polishing it until it gleamed with silent judgment. Don't polish it well enough, and a cook might launch a spoon at your head. Polish it too well, and they'd wonder why you had time left to overachieve. It was a delicate game of strategic mediocrity. Meanwhile, over at the pump, water needed to be drawn. Never mind the frost. There was no plumbing in these chilly realms of domestic purgatory. Every drop of water had to be hauled, boiled, and convinced into usefulness. You became intimately acquainted with the weight of water, which was, by most reliable accounts, exactly 9 grievances per bucket. By the time the other servants groggily shuffled in, junior maids, kitchen boys, and the cook, who had the precise personality of a porcupine wearing a corset, you had already been awake long enough to question every life choice, past and future. But there was no room for reflection. Bacon needed broiling. Scones demanded buttering. And the family upstairs was due to float elegantly into the dining room on clouds of entitlement, expecting egg cups at precisely 8:04. You might think, at this point, Ethel, our notional servant of misfortune, is allowed to sit a moment and sip a lukewarm tea. Alas, no. The day had only just stretched its legs. Next came the coal run, a chore that involved dragging lumps of future ash up several flights of stairs to the drawing rooms and bedrooms where fireplaces yawned hungrily. You could always tell where the family had gone by the trail of discarded gloves and the carefully cultivated absence of gratitude. Then, as the upstairs rooms emptied, it was time to clean them. This meant chamber pots, dear listener. Let us pause a respectful beat for the concept of chamber pots. They were porcelain, deceptively decorative, and full of realities that no lavender sachet could disguise. Emptying them was not just a routine, it was an ordeal. A ballet of balance, smell, and abject despair. And it wasn't only chamber pots. There were hearths to sweep, carpets to beat, beds to make, and windows to polish until they reflected your own gradually waning will to continue. All, of course, while never being seen by the family, unless they rang the bell to summon you, or released the Pomeranian, which had a startling knack for locating ankles. Throughout it all, there was an unwritten rule, as reliable as gravity and just as non-negotiable. Do everything and appear to do nothing. If the house ran smoothly, praise floated vaguely upward, eventually nestling in the lady's pride. If something went amiss, a burnt pudding, a scratched banister, or a mysteriously dented silver spoon, the blame rolled downhill with the efficiency of an avalanche. And still, somehow, there was something quaint about it. Not the work, of course. That was barbaric. But the rhythm of it, the strange dance of routine, the comfort of knowing that even in the most mismatched century, someone would always be obsessively folding napkins while the world carried on above. As the morning rattled toward luncheon, and the roast began its third passive-aggressive protest toward overcooking, Ethel wiped a spot from her apron's hem with a sigh. She had survived the dawn, which meant now she could face the laundry. But that, dear listener, is a story soaked in steam, starch, and secrets all its own. By 5:30 in the brittle morning hush, the servants' day in Edwardian England had already begun to unravel. A creaking floorboard here, a rattling coal scuttle there. A gentle symphony of obligations sounded before the son even considered his own duties. Now, our hypothetical servant girl, we'll call her Eliza, because wouldn't you know, about 1 in every 20 domestic workers answered to that name, was quietly battling her latest challenge, the immobilized aristocratic bedroom fireplace known only for its sullen refusal to light, the kind of fireplace that looked decorative but produced little more than a sneeze of warmth and a great deal of soot upon anyone foolish enough to coax it. Kneeling on the cold stone hearth with her sleeves pushed up to the elbow, because in the Edwardian social hierarchy, sleeves had their own etiquette. Eliza performed the fire ritual. Crumpled newspaper from yesterday's Times, procured after the master had discarded it, but before Cook had commandeered it for fish wrapping duties, was twisted into hopeful spirals, kindling laid like a Jenga tower of false promise. And then the match. Or rather, the search for the one match that hadn't become slightly damp by existing in Britain. Behind her, the heavy silence of Lady Ponsonby's bedroom loomed. My lady herself was still asleep beneath a fluff of eiderdown and several generations of pillow lace, dreaming, presumably, of cucumber sandwiches and her lost whist championship of 1903. Eliza struck the match. It fizzed indignantly, then went out in a purposeful sulk. There was a distinct etiquette to being a servant. Above all, one must never permit one's frustrations to emit any audible frequency. Glaring at the matchbox was permitted, provided clothing rustled softly enough to disguise it. Muttering was strictly the domain of male butlers refusing to dust things they believed too grand to be touched. So Eliza, pure of footfall and heavy of eye, lit a second match. The kindling did catch, eventually, with the moody reluctance of a Victorian gentleman rising from his wing-back chair. But Eliza now smelled faintly of ash and betrayal. No matter. She had 17 more fireplaces waiting, like temperamental house cats, to be convinced of their destiny. In truth, firelighting was only the overture. Full orchestration would soon arrive in the laundry room, a place where damp hung in the air like gossip. Laundry was the tyrant that ruled the downstairs world with a wet iron fist. Every blouse, petticoat and lace insert owned by the family above stairs had to be boiled, scrubbed, wrung, starched, ironed, and occasionally spoken to in soothing tones. The laundry copper, a massive cauldron that would have thrilled Macbeth's witches, bubbled at all hours like a disturbed conscience. Detergents, as we know them now, were still a couple of world wars away. Servants used soap flakes, which were gentle on delicate fabrics while being ferocious on youthful skin. The sensation was not dissimilar to exfoliating your hands with the sharp end of a cheese grater and then congratulating yourself for cleanliness. Eliza, as the junior most of the skivvies, yes, that was an actual job title, had what one might call an intimate relationship with starch. Starch in collars, cuffs, handkerchiefs, and the various frilly bits that made Edwardian fashion resemble elaborate doilies pinned to a person. She stirred the starch bowl mindlessly, like a chef from a culinary dystopia, where all meals tasted like lightly salted paper. The laundry list, truly a list, clipped to the frame of the mangle, was written in a rigid hand that seemed personally offended by the word silk. And while we're on the topic, mangles, if you're unfamiliar, were iron-handled contraptions designed to squash excess water out of clothing and, occasionally, out of the hope a servant might have for future wrist mobility. And yet, somehow, there was comfort in the rhythm, in the squeak of pulleys, the slap of garments on stone, the steam that softened air and moods alike. The routine, though distinctly tyrannical, was also the lullaby of the downstairs life. Each task followed the one before it, with plodding certainty. It was nearly 7 now. The clock in the front hallway ticked with aristocratic authority. Upstairs, the world of linen-sheeted bliss stirred faintly, but did not yet rise. Not before bell number 3. With the last collar pressed, starched, and folded into something approaching an architectural wonder, Eliza stretched her fingers, now tinged with red and resignation. She had 15 minutes, if she didn't count breathing, as a window before breakfast service would begin. She carried the basin downstairs, water sloshing like sleepy applause, and set it down near the back scullery where cook's dominion began. Already Eliza could smell the yeast of rising bread and the distant, impending anxiety of silver polishing. The morning was still young, but her day had grown quite old already. Gently now, back along the corridor where the oil lamps flickered and the echoes of footsteps whispered yesterday's chores. The hush before the household woke was brief, but it was hers. And just ahead, where the butler's pantry stood cloaked in shadow and tweed-scented dignity, came the first faint jingle of a breakfast bell, signaling that things were about to get complicated. There is a particular sound that stays with you after spending time in a grand Edwardian country house. Not the rustle of silk skirts, nor the creak of boot leather on polished oak, but instead, the bell, the dreaded bell system, mounted like jeweled barnacles across the servants' passageways. These mechanical contraptions were the original group text message, except with a lot more shame and absolutely no option to mute. Each bell held a tiny lacquered plaque beneath it, delicately lettered to indicate the room of origin. Morning room, Lady Euphemia's sitting room, gun room, infrequently used. And yes, even a dedicated bell for the butler's pantry, which could only ever summon the butler, who likely considered it an insult. Our dear servant girl would have grown intimate with that jingle-jangle chorus before sunrise. When the house awoke, and by house we mean the whims and whispery commands of half-asleep aristocrats, the bells rang like a chorus of meddling angels, a high-pitched tinkle from the nursery, probably a child losing its mind over a crooked ribbon, a more aggressive ding from the drawing room, likely someone requiring a footstool repositioned to the left, precisely 2 inches. It was a flurry of metallic chatter and small emergencies, and each bell was a summons that demanded immediate obedience, or worse, a talking to from the housekeeper, whose glare could sour milk at 20 paces. The bell system was driven by delicate wires running through the walls, woven through the intestines of the estate like metal veins. Pull a tassel in the blue bedroom. Ping. A bell jangles in the servant hall, and the corresponding pointer needle. Yes, they had tiny golden arrows, helpfully quivers to indicate which grand soul currently requires the most minor of things. It all sounds terribly elegant, doesn't it? Until you remember that if you were the one responding to the bell, you had roughly 42 seconds to wipe your hands on your apron, dash up 3 flights of stairs, and arrive serene and breathless with a "Yes, ma'am." It did not matter that you were polishing the brass bed warmer, or feeding coals into the morning fire, or elbow deep in a suspicious pudding. The bell had tolled, and your presence was now required to watch someone decide between 2 equally hideous hats, and woe betide if the bell jangled more than once. That meant you were late, or missing, or possibly dead, but mostly late. Repeat bell ringers were often those who'd long given up on empathy and gone fully decorative. They arranged their lives like still life paintings and expected the world to move around them. Over time, a kind of language emerged among the servants, much like Morse code, but with more groaning. A rapidly repeated bell from the East Wing, likely one of Lady Agatha's tantrums, usually over ribbon colour, occasionally over existential dread. A single, mournful chime from the library. Mr. Pembroke had fallen asleep with a cigar again, but it wasn't just bells that demanded attention. Housemaids also had to decipher the mysterious bells that didn't ring. A silent button might indicate a cancelled tea, or worse, an expectation unspoken. This was the real test. Not waiting for a bell, but anticipating the next ring before it ever came. Like servants' clairvoyance, only with lower pay and more starch. Still, there were coping mechanisms. Some housemaids developed the exceptional skill of predictive upstairs guest behavior. If the colonel retired to his chamber 30 minutes late, wearing his evening glower, then the bell for gout medication was due in precisely 12 minutes. Others formed silent alliances, passing messages between corridors in brief glances and smuggled biscuit crumbs. But the bell, it remained constant. A shrill reminder from above that one's comfort was always one ring away from destruction. Yes, the real marvel of Edwardian innovation wasn't the motorcar or the telephone. It was the elaborate architecture of domestic need, built on wires, whims, and the echo of footfalls chasing after yet another ding. And somewhere, past the clamour and clatter, our servant girl tiptoes down a back stair, skirts rustling, tray trembling, as a faint jingle sings out from the upper west corridor. Ah, the blue bedroom, again. Heaven help her. Let's see what fresh crisis awaits. Perhaps a lukewarm teacup in peril, or a forgotten powder puff in need of heroic rescue. In the soft pre-dawn murk of an Edwardian kitchen, the only thing louder than the ticking of the long case clock was the resentful hiss of the coal stove, grumbling back to life like it too, resented early mornings. You, of course, as a servant girl in a household that cared very deeply about appearances and very little about human knees, had already been up for a while. Your knees knew it, your corset knew it, and your bladder, long denied due to the unspoken rule that servants shouldn't frequent the main hallway loo, also knew it. Your day had officially begun with the lighting of all 57 fireplaces. Well, maybe not 57, but it certainly felt that way as you shuffled through chilly corridors with a scuttle of coal in one hand and a brass fire poker in the other, like an overworked chimney sprite cursed with noble ambitions. The irony, of course, being that aristocratic residents above never once considered that sparks didn't simply leap into grates on their own accord, like well-trained fox terriers. After the lighting of fires, and before the pre-breakfast tea tray, which must arrive precisely 3 minutes after the lady of the house begins to stir, as though she were a tea-summoning oracle, came the breakfast preparations. Here is where the Edwardian house made its most cunning move, separating the house into upstairs and downstairs, not only spatially, but calorically. While Lady Hyacinth would later nibble on 2 precisely peeled orange segments and a sad slice of something called health toast, you were busy cooking a breakfast that could fuel an artillery unit, porridge for the lesser staff, eggs for the butler and housekeeper, kedgeree for the children who wouldn't touch it, and deviled kidneys for the master of the house, who liked to eat as if he were about to go fox hunting, despite only having hunted compliments at the club since 1889. Each dish had to be perfectly timed, garnished, and plated in accordance with a table plan, more intricate than the Battle of Waterloo. And should something go astray, say a poached egg with less than firm whites, well, that was what the side door was for. Disgrace exited quietly with a satchel and a tearful goodbye to the scullery cat. You might think, perhaps, that serving the meal is the end of it. But no, that is merely an intermission before embarking on the hallowed ritual of the silver. Ah, silverware polishing. A task designed by some perverse alchemist of monotony. It required you to rub approximately 8,000 individual pieces of cutlery to a point of shine so supernatural, it could likely be used to contact spirits. The forks alone were an existential crisis waiting to happen. forks with 4 tines, 3 tines, pastry forks, fish forks, oyster forks, their differences as minute as the soul's will to go on. The butler, Mr. Tillingham, known below stairs as Grim William for his uncanny ability to materialize whenever someone tried to steal a sit, administered the silver inspection with all the gravity of a papal conclave. 1 smudge, 1 fingerprint, 1 wayward speck of salad residue, and you could find yourself reassigned to chamber pot duty, the lowest circle of Edwardian servant tasks. Dante, had he been born in Derbyshire, might have rewritten his Inferno to include it. Lunchtime drew closer, not for you, but for the family upstairs, who required luncheon served at precisely 1 o'clock, and yet still task after task unfolded into the next, like some starch-scented symphony of servitude. Table linens laid down, crystal glasses washed by hand, because the dishwasher wouldn't be invented in a usable form for another 20 years. The luncheon meat carved to resemble tomorrow's dinner animal in a hopeful act of culinary foreshadowing. And all, through it, the quiet dance of invisibility, to serve but never be seen, to glide along corridors like a trained ghost, opening doors just before they're touched, refilling teacups before thirst is admitted, removing dishes with the stealth of regret itself. You'd think, perhaps, you might get to sit for a spell after luncheon, but then you'd remember, to your horror and yet curious satisfaction, that it was Tuesday, and Tuesday meant laundry. But that is a very different amount of pain, and it has its own smell, which we'll explore gently next. As the first soft strokes of morning light crept through the high windows of the scullery, the kitchen below stairs was already alive with the clanging of pots, the hiss of boiling water, and the sleepy curses of someone discovering yet another mouse in the flour bin. Morning, or what a servant girl might resentfully refer to as hour 4 of her shift, had arrived. You, dear listener, were meant to be up an hour ago. Your straw mattress, still warm from a snatched moment of uneasy slumber, lies behind. Your skirts are hastily bundled in one hand, stockings barely pulled on, and as usual, you've lost your garter ribbon again. You'll spend most of the day yanking your left stocking up discreetly, or not so discreetly, depending on your current position in the servant hierarchy. Today begins, as every day does, with the fire. Firelighting was the Edwardian servant girl's CrossFit, except without the flattering yoga pants and with a much higher chance of singed eyebrows. Before any proper lady or gentleman dared unfurl their dainty toes from under the covers, at least 3 fireplaces had to be lit, their ashes from the previous day carefully removed, and the coal scuttles refilled, and, critically, not a speck of soot or evidence of effort was to remain. Fires were meant to appear as though summoned by magic. So yes, your early Edwardian career path involved being both invisible and performing daily feats of elemental wizardry at 5 a.m. Of course, it wasn't just fire. Next, breakfast, but not yours. Heavens no. You trundle down to the great kitchen with its black iron range that seems to stare back at you with judgment. The cook is already there. A wedge of a woman in a grease-stained apron who communicates largely through grunts and the throwing of ladles. She has been up longer than you, fuming over the scullery maid's failure to properly dry the copper pans and muttering unspeakable things about a soggy pheasant. She hands you a list. Eggs to boil, precisely 3 minutes and 45 seconds, no more. Kidneys to grill, but not smell like kidneys, heaven forbid. Toast to be browned without any visible evidence of heat. Bread must be toasted without burning, buttered without melting, and, if possible, be made to taste like something other than disappointment. And all of this must arrive in the dining room via hallway, dumbwaiter, and baffling labyrinth of bell pulls without so much as a crumb misplaced. It's your first true performance of the day. You are a debutante of the breakfast tray, waltzing between bad tempers and hot scones. You are not thanked. After breakfast, it's time to execute what historical sources called morning duties, but which could have just as easily been referred to as the Great Scrub. There are grates to polish, floors to wax, chamber pots to empty, and yes, Lord Langtry's is again a horror show. One suspects he's either dying or eating nothing but pickled eggs. Rugs to beat, windows to sponge down, and sheets to shake out. Anything not sponged, polished, scrubbed, buffed, dabbed, or deloused is subject to a lukewarm scolding from the housekeeper, or worse, a note in the Red Book of Shame, which was not, as it sounds, an Edwardian romance novel, but a ledger of your daily failings. Still, there's a strange rhythm to the rot. You learn the art of silent passage, how to cross a creaky parquet floor without sound. You master the delicate hierarchy of cloths, flannel for the silver, chamois for the mirrors, and that one threadbare rag the cook uses to polish her gin bottle. And somewhere amid the fatigue and footmen whistling off-key, you catch a whiff of the lavender sachets placed beneath the mistress's lingerie drawer, and for one soft second, you recall the scent of your mother's hands. The inch of daylight you snatch during errands to the market feels like a balm. The city, if you're in the city, bustles by in domestic blindness. No one notices you. That's expected. If you're in the countryside, the lane to the dairy is your secret reprieve, a short pilgrimage into birdsong and butter churns that, for a moment, makes labour seem like life rather than sentence. By mid-morning, the bell rings. The lady has spilled hair oil on her writing table, and old Mayhew has cracked a chamber pot while attempting to juggle them, again, possibly for sport. You sigh, curtsy to no one in particular, and begin again. But the steps you take now carry you toward noon, and with it, the sacred 15-minute miracle known as the servant girl's tea break. A moment of warmth, biscuit, and gossip. But hold that thought, softly now. The kettle is just beginning to sing, and you haven't yet heard what Elsie saw in the butler's pantry. Down the rear corridor of Hartwood House, a narrow hallway where skirts brush the wallpaper and candle wax mark the years like tree rings, the servants moved with the solemn grace of bees in a very elaborate hive. Among the more thankless tasks delegated to the lower echelons, i.e., every servant below the rank of butler, which broadly included everyone except the butler, was laundry day. But don't let the word laundry fool you. In Edwardian England, it was less a day and more a multi-day physical and emotional journey. The Lord of the Rings of domestic toil, with considerably more starch. Our poor servant girl, let's call her Elsie, had been up since before the birds, the milkman, and likely the sun. Her hair still smelled faintly of carbolic soap, and her knuckles bore the red badge of courage gained from plunging them into lye-softened water. Welcome, dear sleeper, to the Monday wash. Now, Monday was not picked at random. It was chosen by history, laundry cycles, and cruel tradition. Saturday's grime, Monday's climb, they might have said, had they any breath left to say things. Lacking the miraculous gift of indoor plumbing or gas-powered washing, the entire process began in the scullery, where colossal iron kettles boiled water like vengeful cauldrons. Clothing wasn't just tossed in thoughtlessly like it is today. No. Each item was a scandal waiting to happen. First, the whites, chemises, petticoats, table linens, handkerchiefs of a delicacy you'd be afraid to sneeze into. These were soaked, scrubbed, and starched with what we'll call optimism. Then came the colours, fewer in number, but each a gamble. Few things induced more terror than a lady's muslin blouse blooming lavender after a rogue red sock infiltrated the load. To make the process ever so slightly more theatrical, laundry was often done outside, in the bitter English chill, where the wind slapped your apron like an overzealous governess. The mangle, a soul-crushing contraption with turning rollers, awaited just beyond the kitchen door. It was intended to squeeze the water from clothes, but managed to extract a little hope and cartilage from shoulders as well. Ah, but Elsie, she handled it with an air of quiet martyrdom. Piece by piece, she fed linen through the mangle, careful not to mangle herself. Let's not forget that in 1909, workplace safety consisted mostly of try not to die. The drying process was another affair. Lines were strung in the yard, but when rain came, which in England was always, everything was moved inside, where sheets hung ominously like polite ghosts over kitchen chairs. More refined homes had a drying cupboard, a tall wooden monolith with shelves and a coal fire inside. Essentially, the earliest form of British central heating, except you couldn't sit inside it unless you wanted to become toast, and people did try. The Victorian instinct to climb inside things and wait out your problems was strong. And then came Tuesday, ironing. But not with your dainty plug-in device from the future. No. These were sad irons, a name which makes sense once you've held several pounds of iron warmed on a coal range only to discover the handle was still hot, and your fingerprints were now somebody else's problem. To test for heat, many maids would use their cheek or elbow. It was not uncommon to see a girl spending her afternoon with a faintly barbecued forearm while humming something cheerful like Daisy Bell. Ironing involved pressing every item of clothing to a crisp, from trousers to underpants, to the soft collars worn by gentlemen who apparently found actual laundry far too plebeian. Some households had as many as 7 different types of irons for different tasks. One for pleats, one for lace, one for sleeves, and at least one that was there purely to intimidate the new staff. Every finished article was inspected by the housekeeper. Woe betide the girl who left a wrinkle, or, heaven forbid, scorched a hem. A scorched hem was moral failure by fabric, a sin against cotton. And so Tuesday bled into Wednesday, and the great tide of wet and dried and crisped cloth was returned to its proper places. By then, Elsie's arms felt like boiled sausages, her back was a patchwork of pain, and her soul was lightly pressed with starch and regret. But by the glow of the paraffin lamp in her attic room that evening, Elsie finally had a moment of peace. Her hands still smelled of lavender soap and burn ointment. She tugged the quilt up to her chin and let her eyes close. Sleep came gently across the rooftops of Heartwood, while tomorrow quietly prepared itself, as it often did, with dust and a bucket, the most dreaded sound in a servant girl's day, besides the jangle of the breakfast bell at dawn, was the echoing thunk of Miss Euphemia Draper's corset busk landing on the floor, not because it was particularly loud, but because it meant it was time. Time for you to embark upon the most delicate operation in the entirety of British domestic service, dressing the lady. Now, dressing a proper Edwardian lady wasn't simply a question of putting on clothes. Oh no. One did not haphazardly lob garments in her general direction like a laundress flinging out bloomers on wash day. No, we're talking layers of stiff tradition, fragile fabric, and social anxiety stacked like a Victoria sponge on Empire Day. First came the chemise and the drawers. These were theoretically underwear, though calling them that might upset Aunt Bertha at the tea table. Loose, billowy, ankle length, and designed for maximum airflow, because naturally, in an age where women's lungs were under constant assault by corsets and social expectations, ventilation was key. Then came the corset itself. This was the make or break moment for many a scullery maid with aspirations of rising through the ranks. The corset required dexterity, patience, and a touch of sadism. For being gentle wouldn't get you promoted, and being too firm might get you dismissed, or worse, talked about behind heavily gloved hands at Tuesday Bridge Club. Once the corset was secured, tightly enough to ensure an hourglass figure, but just loose enough to avoid spontaneous fainting spells when Lady Euphemia walked past the windowsill geraniums. Then came the corset cover, because God forbid anyone should see the corset directly and perish from shock. Every layer had its mystery to protect. Next, petticoats, often 2 or 3, depending on the season, the occasion, and whether the lady had recently read an article in the Lady's Realm about the dangers of catching drafty knees. Add in the hip pads, also known by their decidedly unfortunate moniker bum rolls, and you begin to understand why one never simply got dressed. One prepared for it the way an athlete prepares for the Olympics, except with more lace and slightly more passive aggression. Then came the dress itself. Morning gowns tended to be lighter, more sensible garments worn for grave household interactions, such as sipping tea with one's second-best acquaintance, or reading poetry aloud to a spaniel named Balthazar. You, as the maid, were expected to hold up voluminous sleeves while minding the buttons, hooks, and eyes. Those miniature torture devices that prompted more than one dressing room tantrum when they became lost in overly intricate lace panels. Shoes came next. These were often slippers with buttons so tiny they required a specialized hook, not unlike trying to perform surgery on a hedgehog while blindfolded. And once the shoes were on, topped by decorative stockings with names like Dresden Rose or Evening Glimmer, you were forgiven for heaving a discreet sigh of triumph. But don't get cocky, there was still hair, jewelry, gloves, and of course the hat. Ah yes, the hat. The monument atop the monument. A proper Edwardian hat could weigh up to 2 pounds and featured everything from ostrich feathers to entire taxidermy birds, all gothically sprawled atop Lady Euphemia's carefully pinned coiffure, like one had offended a milliner and he'd taken artistic revenge. The truth is, Edwardian fashion was less about beauty and more about behaving like a very elegant, well-curated Christmas tree. One wrong thread, literally, and the whole tinsel-wrapped illusion could collapse. So you, as the maid, were not just dressing the lady. You were holding up the very structure of Edwardian, propriety with a hatpin and a prayer. And once your lady had swept out of her chamber, stiffly, like a sentient doily off to prosecute a misdelivered scone, you were left behind, staring at an explosion of silk and pins and sighs, wondering how anyone had the energy to frock and frolic in 1908. Still, there was a certain grace in the chaos, a rhythm to the rituals. If you squinted, it did begin to feel like a quiet waltz between time periods, the past tugging at your fingers as you tied a sash, buttoned a cuff, smoothed a fold. But now the morning toilette was complete. The lady stately, the corset groaning, and you thinking wistfully of the cool stone floor of the scullery, far from feathers and frills. Still, your day wasn't even half begun, because somewhere down the marble corridor, there was breakfast to be served. And next, we turn to the fine art of surviving. That, the crack of dawn in the great houses of Edwardian England, was less a gentle sunrise and more an orchestral crescendo of clattering coal buckets, muttered complaints from bleary-eyed maids, and the occasional soft print step of cook on her stealthy mission for tomorrow's sweet. For poor Lily, our persevering servant girl, it was also the moment her dreams of marrying an itinerant stable boy with striking cheekbones were brutally interrupted by the shrill bell of the scullery. Nothing stripped romance from your imagination, quite like the smell of boiling cabbage. Scullery maids, of course, lived in the lowest rungs of the servant hierarchy, or, as some butlers called it, the moist level. Their universe consisted largely of dishwashing, pan-scraping, and a curious intimacy with lard. Lily had learned to recognize every type of Edwardian grease with greater accuracy than a chemist. Pudding fat was pale and compliant. Roasting goose left a shiny varnish on silverware. And suet. Well, sweat clung to her soul. This morning, she stood knee-deep in dishes. The saucepans had, apparently, thrown a riot in the night, forming a greasy revolution beneath the work table. Above, the kitchen maid, Doris, whose mood hovered between thundercloud and mild gale, hurled onions into a pot like she was settling a personal score. "Chop those carrots, would you?" barked Doris, soot smudged from forehead to frown. "And don't, for pity's sake, breathe on 'em." Lily obeyed, as all obedient scullery maids do, her fingers stiff from the biting cold that lived permanently in the corners of the kitchen. Large estate kitchens were rarely heated in the servant areas. Why waste good coal when you could simply rub your hands together and cry? Meanwhile, above stairs, that shimmering world of embroidered slippers and marmalade on toast, conversations included topics like whether the drawing room curtains should be duck egg or merely soft celadon. Lily, listening from her domain, was fairly sure those were just fancy codes for blue. The great irony, of course, was that despite the lavish meals prepared, servants rarely ate the same food. A crust of bread, cabbage soup, suspiciously devoid of actual cabbage, and something called dripping toast were the usual fare. Dripping toast, in Lily's estimation, was toast reclined beneath a rain of meat fat, and it was only tolerated after one's taste buds had been permanently numbed. Still, there were small joys. The kettle hissed merrily each morning as if it were gossiping about the master's latest affair, and, historically speaking, it might have been. Household rumours filtered down with astonishing speed, carried on the back of linen napkins and the quick feet of footmen with loose lips. And then, mid-morning, came one of the pivotal rituals of any Edwardian household: polishing. Lily, now soaped and scrubbed herself into a semi-respectable appearance, turned her attention to the silver. The amount of silver requiring daily buffing suggested that the family had funded entire armies in teaspoons alone. Each piece was like an elderly aristocrat, fragile, high maintenance, and prone to tarnishing without adequate flattery. As Lily laboured over a particularly obstinate candelabra, the butler glided in like a majestic heron in tailcoat. "Steady hand, scullery girl," he said, in a voice undoubtedly trained at Stiff Upper Lip Academy. "The Lady Dowager is insisting upon all items in the salon being absolutely immaculate." Apparently, last week's luncheon guest spotted a fingerprint on the horseradish spoon. Lily nodded reverently, concealing the urge to ask how someone managed to fingerprint horseradish in the first place. Afternoon brought a lull when the footmen rehearsed their synchronized napkin folding, a sport taken more seriously than fencing, and Lily was dispatched to assist housemaid Alice in the bedroom wing. Delicate work this, puffing pillows without disturbing the fringe, smoothing counterpanes as if one were caressing the very concept of serenity. "Don't touch Lady Edith's perfume bottles," Alice warned. "Last girl did and ended up fainting. Too much lavender and regret." As Lily tiptoed past the embroidered bedsheets and stifled a sneeze from the wafting clouds of sachets, she wondered, not for the first time, how anyone managed to sleep on a bed frame shaped like a full orchestra. But then, with the sun slipping quietly toward tea time and the upper classes debating over whether to cut sandwiches in triangles or squares, Lily was caught in a brief moment of solitude. The linen cupboard, warm, softly lit, and smelling of starch and lilac, was her sanctuary. She sank onto a folded tablecloth, stacked like ancient knowledge, and let her eyelids droop just for a moment. Her peace was short-lived. A bell rang. Something upstairs would need dusting. With a special feathered wand, and possibly an opinion on whether the piano stool had been reupholstered in last season's velvet. And so, Lily rose, a wrinkle in her apron and a dream still barely clinging, ready to face the next peculiar corner of Edwardian service, where even the clocks needed polishing, and time itself always marched in crisp, well-buffed shoes. By the time the hallway clock chimed a languid 2 o'clock, the kind of hour when humans are not meant to be conscious, especially not with a mop in hand, our servant girl had recently graduated from lunch service to the post-luncheon wash-up. A deceptively simple phrase that sounds like a mild inconvenience, but involves enough scrubbing, scalding, and crockery clattering to qualify as an Olympic event. And yet, she endured it all with the weary grace of someone who knew that the alternative, i.e., not doing it, was unemployment with a generous side of hunger and possible social doom. The afternoon shift brought a change in tempo, if not in actual rest. For most, it would be considered the slump between hearty Edwardian banquets, a time for genteel digestion and light gossip about one's gout. For the servant girl, it was when the house exhaled and then asked her to polish the furniture. Polishing, you'll be glad to know, was not a metaphor. It literally meant kneeling before every item of wooden inheritance in the house, from grand sideboards the size of narrowboats to dainty tea tables, caressing their surfaces with beeswax and relentless elbow grease. The Edwardians possessed a particular affection for mahogany, a wood chosen for its beautiful grain and popularity among chairmen, but also for its ability to collect dust at a molecular level. Our girl would dab her cloth into the little tin of polish, a scent of lavender and death by labour wafting up as she worked her way around the drawing room. The drawing room, incidentally, was devoted almost entirely to not drawing anything. Instead, it was where ladies sat to pretend not to be bored, while secretly being bored out of their tightly corseted minds. The room had spotless antimacassars on every armrest, little lace inventions designed to catch the grooming products of Victorian-era hairdos, but now mostly just caught confusion between wood, lace, porcelain figurines, and the perpetual risk of knocking over something that cost more than her yearly wage. She moved like an archaeologist in a landmine field. And then came the bell. The servant bell system, invented to maximize upstairs convenience and downstairs chaos. Concealed wires fed through the belly of the house, ending in a jangling little box on the kitchen wall, where numbered dials lit up like an accusatory advent calendar. Each bell rang with its own personality. Some tinkled politely, others clanged like a ship going down. Today it was bell number 4. Lady Barkham's sitting room, also known as the inner sanctum of tea, cushion plumping, and general noble lounging. Our servant girl wiped her hands, straightened her apron, and made her way up, always careful to walk on the edge of stair carpet to avoid wear, another punishment-worthy offence. Upon entering, she was greeted by the contents of at least 3 different knitting baskets and the unmistakable fog of rose sachets. Lady Barkham barely turned her head. "Fetch the embroidery silks. And no mauve this time. Mauve is for Tuesdays." The girl blinked once, bowed silently, and retreated. She was fairly certain that last Tuesday had also been a no mauve Tuesday, but there were more dangerous hills to die on, like dry laundry hills where she would soon be spending the next hour. Laundry, contrary to romantic tales of sunlit linens and giggling washerwomen, was a brutal territorial war, mainly against soot, starch, and undergarments. Drying it in winter, especially inside houses more drafty than a windowless barn, involved a precarious ballet of racks, ropes, and desperate hope. Wet drawers swayed gently above long-forgotten radiators, while pillowcases formed ghost lines in the dim attic air. But the real horror began when laundering collided with ironing. Ironing in 1910 was not a light activity done while humming along to music. It was iron in its purest, most elemental form. Actual lumps of metal, heated in coal-fired stoves until they could double as medieval weaponry. Our servant girl wielded one with a thick rag and the dead-eyed focus of a person who had both burned and scorched in equal measure before. She pressed petticoats until they surrendered, ran her hand gently over stiffened collars, and whispered apologies to slightly singed lace trim. It was a quiet, steamy sort of combat, with the smell of hot fabric ever hanging in the air, a scent that mingled with duty and faint despair. As shadows lengthened and the sky outside began its polite descent into twilight, the house shifted again. Somewhere upstairs, a lady sighed. Somewhere downstairs, the soup pot grumbled. And our servant girl, with hands warm from the iron, looked toward the narrow window and spotted the first flicker of gaslights along the street. Dinner loomed, of course, and with it, more silver to polish and more plates to vanish without a trace of fingerprints. But just now, in this little pause between demands, there was the hush of linen cooling, beeswax lingering in the air, and the soft creak of a house preparing for evening. Soon the parlour bell would ring again. By the time the first snowflakes whispered across the frost-hardened lawns at Thornbury Hall, Margaret had achieved a worldly wisdom, known only to those who've blacked boots in complete darkness, memorized a bell sequence more complex than Morse code, and survived Lady Evelina's inquiries about where the good haddock has vanished to. It had, unsurprisingly, not vanished. The butler had eaten it. This evening began like many others at the servant girl's end of the food chain, by scraping the gelatinous aftermath of aspic moulds off painted porcelain plates in the scullery under the vigilant eye of Mrs. Crumple, the cook. Mrs. Crumple was not a woman so much as a culinary dragon, her cheeks permanently flushed from the heat of ovens and the rage of being asked to repeat herself. She spoke in riddles and orders. "Don't let the tongue go dry again, girl, or you'll be boiling tripe with your bare hands," she warned, feeding logs into the great hearth oven. The Edwardian kitchen was not the rosy, copper-lit dream of modern nostalgia magazines. It was more like a mildly haunted ship galley bolted to a 50-room stately home, churning out symmetrical jellies and meat pies for people who thought watercress was a status symbol. Margaret, in her ever-damp apron, had grown oddly fond of the rhythm of kitchen life, There was the rush of pudding steam, the hiss of a just-doused stove, the curious camaraderie of girls who'd developed an entire language out of raised eyebrows and sighs. She'd also become exceptionally skilled at whisking eggs with one arm while reaching for crustless bread triangles with the other, a minor miracle of dexterity likely worth knighthood, or at the very least, being allowed to eat a scone without hiding behind the bins. Though her days were long and dictated by bells and starch, there were moments that felt as if the house itself was in on the secret. Moments like tonight, when all of Thornbury Hall exhaled into evening stillness, and those who toiled inside its stone belly began to steal back slivers of themselves. Lucy, tiny, bird-like Lucy, snuck a candied violet from under a silver dome as she carried the tray toward the drawing room. She grinned at Margaret, who was silently counting forks. 2 short, 2 long, 1 unintelligible curlicue that turned out to be an oyster fork, naturally, because heaven forbid one consume seafood with regular cutlery. They did not pause long, for Margaret still had to prepare the warming pans, those curious brass devices slipped into icy beds to trick the upstairs folk into believing that winter did not exist. Carrying them up the servants' stairwell was a slow, perilous task, half mountaineering, half dodging older footmen with complaints about their knees. She once overheard Mr. Pritchard say he would gladly swap both of his for a weekend in Brighton. Tonight, as she padded softly down the corridor approaching the blue room, she passed the gallery of oil paintings, stern ancestors, looking as though they'd charge a fee for eye contact, and glanced briefly at a particularly gloomy man with an eyebrow the size of a hairbrush. "Bet you never had to cut Brussels sprouts into floral shapes," she muttered at him. At the blue room, Margaret lit the candle sconces and slipped the warming pan between the sheets like an apologetic ghost. She often wondered what it would be like to sleep in a bed that wasn't wooden, narrow, and 6 inches from another girl's snoring mouth. But she didn't resent it as much as she once had. Sleep, after all, was sweeter when hard won, like stolen jam or a moment's silence. Back in the kitchen, Mrs. Crumple was soaking her feet in a bucket and pretending not to. The fire snapped gently, the plates had been stacked, and someone had found an illicit heel of bread behind the flour tins. Margaret sat at the end of the prep table, her arms wrapped around herself like a shawl made of relief. She let her eyes drift closed for a second, only to snap them open when George the hallboy started humming what was either Wagner or an attempt at sneezing in tune. No one could ever be sure. Soon, midnight would come ticking along the hall's ancient grandfather clock, dragging another day into memory, and with it would arrive the soft creeping of morning pastries, fire-laying, and Lady Evelina's ongoing campaign against lukewarm cocoa. But for now, in the middle world, between supper and sleep, the kitchen belonged to the servants, and to the silence, and to the rising moon over the slates of Thornbury Hall. And somewhere, in the maze of linen closets and servants' passages, an over-polished brass boot jack had just gone missing, setting in motion a chain of events that would very nearly bring the entire household to chaos. If you've ever sighed dramatically upon washing a single spoon, brace yourself, for we are about to descend into the sudsy underworld of Edwardian scullery life. Down in the belly of a grand Edwardian house, a realm vaguely warmer than the grave and perpetually steamy, you'd find the scullery. Or rather, you wouldn't find it, because by the time you reached it, you would have either slipped on a damp stone or expired from the scent of boiling mutton fat. The scullery maid, lowest of the low and presumably made of sterner starch than most of us, ruled this infernal kingdom. Except she did not rule anything. She belonged to the category of humans that Victorian manuals generously described as barely mentioned but tremendously crucial. Now, imagine you are this maid. You've slept, as usual, in a small cupboard-esque space near the kitchen, close enough to the hearth to be warm, but not so close that anyone thought you might be deserving of comfort. You awoke earlier than everyone else. Even the house cat snored luxuriously when you slipped from your lumpy cot into your coarse, lard-scented apron. Your first task? Reviving the kitchen range from its nightly smoulder. You don't ignite it, you court it. First with raked-out ashes, then with carefully stacked kindling. Pray it lights, otherwise the cook's mood will blacken more quickly than burnt porridge. And she's been known to shout loud enough to wilt the pantry herbs. Then it's on to the washing. And what washing it is. An endless parade of pots, pans, tureens, ladles, strainers, kettles, and enough jelly molds to supply a diplomatic banquet. Though the upper servants enjoy their strewn linen and polished brass, none consider where the luster comes from. Hint, it's you and your raw, overwashed hands. You do not have gloves. Gloves are for ladies, or at least for maids ranked high enough to dust around the family's collection of miniature Venetian gondolas. Your chief companions are lye soap, a bucket of greasy water, and a brush so stiff it could defend a fortress. Your favorite pastime is not thinking at all, and simply scrubbing in time to the kitchen's peculiar creaks and drips. Occasionally, you do allow your mind to wander, perhaps to a romantic novel you overheard someone mention, or the idea that somewhere in a field of daisies, tea is served to someone like you instead of by you. Daisies have possibly never touched your actual boots. The cook bangs something overhead. You bound up like a startled squirrel on command. Today she wants calf's foot jelly again. You fetch the slippery, awkward things from the larder, trying not to gag. You have gagged before, early on. You now simply hum through your nose and pretend they are misshapen root vegetables instead of what they are. Before you can return to scrubbing the remains of last night's fish course, there's a delivery. The fishmonger, rolled up in scales and salt air. You haul in the slabs of haddock and the slightly resentful lobsters, careful not to make eye contact with anyone or anything that still blinks. You scarcely finish when, oh surprise, the boot scrubbing must be done. For at 11 a.m, his lordship might choose to visit his cows, and heaven forbid the soles of his boots speak of yesterday's duck dung. You scrub them in the yard, grey soap and all, while the upstairs maids rehearse gossip involving a footman's misplaced cravat, and it's not even tea time. But something odd happens, sometime around the 30th saucepan. A curious kind of peace, not joy, don't leap ahead, but something quieter. A satisfaction in getting something truly, exquisitely clean. You hold a polished copper pot to the light and see your own grimy face in it. Worn but there. Perhaps, just perhaps, copper is a bit magical. And then, of course, the dog vomits in the boot hall, and it's your job to clean it. Yet this is scullery wisdom. No matter what spills, scalds, boils over or breaks, you carry on. A little sore-footed saint of sanitation, armed with elbow grease, biscuit crumbs, and the occasional moment of dreamlike peace. Just long enough to wonder if the housekeeper ever truly likes anyone, or if her heart is filled with porridge. But don't drift off yet. There's more beneath the lace-frilled order of the house, and not all of it smells like soap suds. Keep close now. We're just about to dust the drawing room secrets. Somewhere between the clatter of teacups and the creak of an over-polished banister, our servant girl finds herself dispatched to the task that separates the hardy from the hopeless, ironing her lady's undergarments. Yes, you heard that correctly. Not the gowns, not the gloves, not even the lace-trimmed handkerchiefs embroidered in what can only be described as royal whisper beige. No, today was the day of petticoats, bloomers and chemises, those linings of lace that spawned more sweat than scandal downstairs in the servants' quarters. Ironing in Edwardian England was a labour not unlike blacksmithing, if blacksmithing involved starch, infernal heat, and a steady risk of igniting one's employer's ruffled drawers into a romantic blaze. The irons themselves were solid beasts, heavy things made of cast iron with handles that grew hot enough to sear the fingerprints clean off anyone not paying attention. Unlike the snazzy electric ironing apparatuses of our contemporary era, which also double as sleek obstacles to step over when one's cat knocks them down, Edwardian flat irons had to be heated on a coal stove. Imagine holding a slab of metal, hotter than love under a corset, and pressing it carefully onto fabric so delicate it could sense your fear. Our girl comes to this particular challenge with nerves of linen and fingers already pink from a morning spent scouring chamber pots. But there's no room for complaint. The head housemaid, a woman who communicates exclusively in sighs and judgmental glances, has placed exacting standards upon every fold and pleat. A scorched bloomer's frill could trigger a scandal, or worse, a scolding. Even acquiring the ironing gear is a saga of its own. First, there's the iron rest, a trivet-like implement resembling something you might use to brand cattle, but more dangerous. Then, the beeswax cloth, the sprinkle bottle, this is before steam era, mind you, and the tailor's ham. No, not a meat platter. Instead, that's a firm cushion used to iron curves and gather seams, though it wouldn't surprise anyone if someone had once tried to eat it. Starving maids in drafty pantries don't always read labels enthusiastically. Now, our maid, sleeves rolled and brow set, bare feet carefully planted on cool flagstone, lifts the first iron from the hob. It is precisely the shade of worry. She performs the time-honoured iron test. Spit on it. The water sizzles and disappears at a criminal speed. Too hot. Back to the iron rest it goes. Wait. Breathe. Listen to the soothing pop and hiss of the stove. She selects another garment, a filmy slip trimmed in lace so fine it seems to shimmer in sympathy with the air. She positions it on the board, a rough-hewn plank balanced between two wobbly stools, then uses a bit of waxed cloth to prevent scorching, the maid's equivalent of insurance. With steady hands born of exhaustion, she presses one edge, then the next. Her rhythm is a thing of tragedy and grace. Press, lift, shift. Wipe the brow on the back of one hand. Rise to avoid the soot the wind has blown through the half-shut window. Apologize to the iron gods when a thread catches. It's not glamorous labour, but it is art. If art included the dull ache of the upper spine and an inexplicable urge to scream into a freshly ironed pillowcase. One bloomer's pair proves especially treacherous. Intricate embroidery in mock Victorian motifs. Hundreds of tiny rosebuds dancing along the hem, like they'd been placed there solely to torment the working class. She mutters something impolite in the general direction of Lady Chatterbrook's decorative preferences. And there, through the steam and the quiet crackle of the fire, something sacred floats in the stillness. Accomplishment. A pile of underthings, flattened to English excellence. Fabric that no longer crumples, but stars in its own domestic opera. Because in Edwardian service, you didn't need applause. You needed your work ironed well enough that it didn't make Lady Chatterbrook sneeze or wonder aloud whether mould had taken up residence where starch should be. As the final puff of steam dissolves into the wood beam ceiling, the maid places the last garment atop the pile, lifts the bundle into her arms, and inhales the satisfied scent of hot cotton and tomorrow's dissatisfaction. The bell, inevitably, rings again. It always does. She trudges toward the main house, ironically still in need of a good ironing herself, as a new trial looms closer in the drawing room. Toddlers, tea, and tantrums in powdered form. But for one glorious upstairs minute, not a wrinkle in sight. The carpets, oh those wretched carpets. They stretch thick and ornamental across the grand halls and staircases of Edwardian manor homes, each of them woven in impossibly complex patterns that looked vaguely like aggressive paisley, and vaguely like someone had spilled Sunday supper onto a rug and called it aesthetic. They were a nightmare to clean, not that the lady of the house would know. That was strictly the servant girl's realm. Yours, in fact. Because after all the dusting, black leading of the hearth, and polishing of brass knobs that never seemed to stay shiny longer than a sneeze, it was your noble duty to wage war with the carpet sweeper. Not a vacuum, oh no. We're still squarely pre-Hoover Revolution here. You had instead something like a wooden box on wheels, with a handle and aspirations. Abyssal, possibly. Its wheels turned with the sonic grace of a crying fox, and it barely picked up dust unless you issued a series of threats under your breath. You'd sweep in rhythmic rows, pretending to be graceful, because at any moment her ladyship might appear, slippers whispering across parquet, and you had to look like a maid in a painting. The unpaid theatre of servanthood. And while you were down there, sweeping and cursing elegantly, you might spot it, a frayed bit of the border, maybe curling up like it wanted to stage an uprising. Repairing it wasn't in your job description, but not alerting the housekeeper to it. A social crime of Downton-grade seriousness. By the next afternoon, you could find yourself detailing brass umbrella stands as punishment for your silence. The Edwardian household did not run on fairness. It ran on hierarchy, resentment, and tea. This, of course, brings us to tea. Afternoon tea, the sacred ritual in which the family consumes somewhere between 3 and 12 varieties of starch on porcelain, fragile enough to whisper about. Scones, finger sandwiches, little cakes with more icing than moral character. It wasn't just a snack, it was a performance. And like any good performance, it required a backstage crew, primarily you. You'd carry the tea tray like a sleep-deprived juggler, praying that the mismatched saucer didn't betray you as a member of the Cretan class. Not that anyone would say so aloud. The Edwardians preferred passive aggression served with jam. Pouring tea was no simple task. It involved understanding how long each guest liked their brew steeped, because apparently even leisure had bureaucracy. Some wanted it strong enough to question your life decisions. Others preferred it pale as moonlight and just as elusive. Milk first for the radicals, tea first for the traditionalists. One wrong order and you'd be met with a thin smile and the kind of silence that could curdle cream. But that's the top of the house. Back below stairs, in the clatter and clang of reality, you'd paddle your way through washing up 67 pieces of crockery with one cracked bar of soap that had seen better world wars. And amid the steaming sinks and slippery floors, you'd hear the latest gossip from the kitchen maid that the new footman might have hair oil habits suspiciously suggestive of upward ambition. Everyone had their theories. Whether he'd marry up or be sacked for insubordination, i.e., looking too directly at the butler, was hotly debated. You, sensibly, said nothing. You'd learned that in this world of starch and shadows, power came not from status, but from knowing whose jam tarts mysteriously go missing on Thursdays. Sometimes, in the small golden hour before dinner, when the house was briefly quiet, and even the scullery seemed to take a breath, you'd retreat, or escape rather, to the attic window. There, perched beside the drying laundry, and old trunks full of ancestral secrets no one bothered to open, you'd watch the pale sky shift towards dusk. The other girls might be knitting, or reading penny novels full of scandalous scenes no actual servant would survive. You preferred to imagine what it might be like to drink tea without someone judging your posture, or to leave crumbs and not but feel like you desecrated sacred ground. Sleep touched everything gently in those moments. Even the relentless reality of endless chores dulled to a sort of musical rhythm, like the thrum of the old boiler downstairs, always groaning, always on the verge of quitting, but never quite setting the place on fire. And as the dinner bell echoed through the old bones of the house once more, right on cue, a new shift would begin, under candlelight and curt orders. But perhaps your thoughts lingered, just a little longer, up there in the attic, with stars blinking to life above laundry lines. Eventually, even the grandest drama must pause for breath. Sometimes that breath smells like cabbage. Still, it carries us onward, toward the truest test of a servant girl's mettle, dinner service, and the terrifying magic of silverware arrangement. The hour before dawn was always the oddest. Too late for sleep, too early for breakfast, and just dim enough for every scullery maid in England to briefly wonder if time had surrendered entirely. In the ancient hush between candlelight and sunrise, our servant girl, poor Annie with her wilted cap and heavier than she looked duster, emerged from her corner bed beneath the back staircase. This was prime ghost weather, but Annie had little time for spirits unless they were hiding in the brandy decanter, and if they were, she'd pour them right back into the pantry. The house was still, save the comforting crackle of the range, banked low overnight like a resting dragon. In the kitchen, copper pots slept in tidy rows along the wall, gleaming weakly in the lantern's buttery glow. Annie wound through the shadows, her feet so practiced on creaky flagstones that she could dodge the squeaky tile near the scullery sink, with nary a thought. She didn't want to wake Cook yet, not because of kindness, but because Cook was a terrifying woman who could insult 3 generations of your bloodline before her slippers even touched the floor. This morning, Annie's first task was polishing silver, a quaint, horrible process that involved equal parts elbow grease, chalk powder, and existential questioning. She wiped a teapot till her reflection blinked back at her like a ghost who also hated mornings. Silver polish in Edwardian England was a possessive beast. It stained your fingers an aristocratic shade of grey and stunk vaguely of something no one wanted to discuss. Legend had it that one unlucky butler in Hampshire lost 2 toenails after sniffing too close to a dodgy brand called Mrs. Lively's Lustrous Shine. Naturally, it was Cook's favourite. By the time the rest of the kitchen staff began trickling in, yawning, shivering, muttering about dreams of dying in coal scuttles, Annie had already laid out breakfast trays for upstairs. Toast, lightly burnt for Lady Worthing, because she claimed it helped her digestion, or her sense of moral superiority, one couldn't be certain. Soft-boiled eggs for the twins, who would loudly hate them, and a suspiciously pinkish sausage requested by Sir Basil that was, Annie was almost certain, partially made of regret. Daisy, the tweenie, slipped in behind her, a smudge already forming on the tip of her nose. "Morning, Annie," she whispered, peering into the marmalade jar as if it might contain clues to a simpler life. "Morning, love. You're late." "No, I'm not. You are. I've been polishing spoons since the stars were out. We've all grown a decade older, and at least one ghost has started haunting the gravy boat." Daisy giggled and tripped over the cat's bowl, which earned her a muttered curse from the undercook, and a lecture from the housekeeper later about the sanctity of haddock buns. The cat did not care, as long as the haddock arrived eventually. During upstairs breakfast, Annie entered the drawing room like a polite shadow. A maid had to be silent, invisible, and able to flatten herself against a wall faster than a beetle in danger. She cleared plates with a grace honed by endless repetition, listening to Lady Worthing complain that the new housemaid folded her gloves incorrectly. Unforgivable, truly. One had to wonder how civilization had made it this far. After breakfast, there was drawing room duty, which involved rearranging ornamental pillows with the tender reverence of a museum, conservator, and just as much existential dread. You could spend 20 minutes fluffing one velvet bolster, only for the lady of the house to sweep in and declare it puffed with the wrong attitude. Puffed with the wrong attitude. Still, Annie managed to survive drawing room duty without committing treason or openly sobbing into a vase, which historically placed her among the top 10 most successful servant girls in the northern counties. By lunchtime, the house felt alive with activity, bells ringing, footsteps echoing, and the constant low-level panic of someone having misplaced the asparagus tongs. Annie, however, slipped away for a moment, just one precious moment, to the back garden wall, where she could eat her crust of bread in peace and let Wiggins, the garden boy, tell her about the mole he'd seen tunneling under the rosebed. Big brute he was, like a velvet sausage with delusions of grandeur. Annie chuckled and didn't even mind the butterless bread, because for once, all was quiet. Wiggins had a talent for making anything sound like an epic tragedy, particularly when it involved small mammals or biscuits, but peace was temporary, as always. A bell rang from the study. The master required something, likely tea or possibly a dictionary, or his misplaced monocle again, which had been hiding behind the mantel clock for 2 weeks. Annie sighed, brushed crumbs from her apron, and straightened her cap with the dignity of a duchess disguised as a drudge. She bravely re-entered the house, off to answer yet another bell in a system that spoke in chimes and never said thank you. Still, there were worse fates than being summoned, as long as you hadn't forgotten to puff the pillows, properly, with the correct emotional resonance. And so, with pockets full of crumbs and a heart full of moles, Annie tiptoed back through the corridors, toward new tasks, odd demands, and an unexpected encounter just beyond the morning room. The drawing room bell rang at precisely 20 minutes after 4, as it always did, like a primly predictable goose announcing tea time to the world. And like clockwork, or more accurately, like a member of the underpaid and overstarched domestic ranks, our weary servant girl, Annie, sprang into motion with the resolve of a soldier in a corset. Tea time was less of a charming ritual and more of a battlefield, a delicate ballet where one false move could turn Earl Grey into court-martial. You see, in Edwardian England, tea wasn't just a drink, it was a cultural performance. And to the upper classes, the correct presentation of a cucumber sandwich carried the emotional gravity of a military parade. Napkin folded just so. Spoon aligned with the sugar tongs. Doilies, those intricately lacy little burdens, placed with surgeon-like precision. Heaven help the servant who allowed a rogue crumb to infiltrate the silver tray. There were ladies of the manor with sharper eyes than a falcon and crueler judgments than a courtroom. To prepare for tea time, Annie had to complete the full kettle opera. First, she descended into the steamy, cabbage-scented underworld that was the scullery. The kettle itself was roughly the size of a small pig, made from blackened copper and weighing enough to turn one's upper body into a one-woman rowing team. She had to scrub it. Yes, scrub the outside of the kettle. Because, perish the thought, someone might glimpse it as it entered the room. Nothing, in Edwardian England, was immune to the tyranny of appearances. She'd then boost it onto the range, a cast-iron beast that belched heat and soot and fumes until the air in the kitchen felt like a Victorian novel. Dense, slightly tragic, and full of mysterious vapours. The teapot, which the mistress insisted be pre-warmed with hot water — a lukewarm teapot is practically a criminal offence — had to be brought near the boiler, creating yet another opportunity to lose one's eyebrows, to steam. And then, the tea leaves. Stored in a locked tin so valuable, one would think it contained the crown jewels. The tea was doled out with the careful precision of opium. Only the housekeeper held the key, and unlocking it required an air of solemn ritual. A teaspoon's worth was considered generous, a tablespoon, reckless extravagance. The mistress would never let it pass. One time, Annie had dared to suggest using a cheaper blend for the downstairs staff. The housekeeper had looked at her as though she'd proposed hosting a picnic with anarchists. And so, after boiling, steeping, straining, and coaxing the tea into the proper bone china pot, painted with small, smug roses, Annie hoisted the full tray up the stairs. Oh, the stairs. Stairs in Edwardian houses weren't just architectural features. They were endurance trials, wooden, steep, and designed by someone who clearly loathed leg muscles. With one knee protesting and the other wobbling like weak jelly, she reached the drawing room, a chamber so dainty it felt like being inside a frosted cake. Click. The door opened on a room full of ladies feathered like tropical birds and men pretending not to be hungry. The conversation hovered delicately around the weather, piano recitals, and people who had proven disappointingly common. Annie set the tray down without a clink, the ultimate servant flex, and retreated with the elegance of a ninja in sensible shoes. But her tea-time duties were far from over. After all, someone had to clear the cups, now smeared with ladylike lipstick and sticky with marmalade fingerprints. Someone had to scrub them, polish them, and stack them in the china cabinet, in an order so obsessively specific it would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. And for all her efforts, Annie's reward was not tea. Oh no, that was for the family alone. She might, if she was very lucky, be allowed a damp biscuit in the scullery sometime after 6. Still, she found a quiet pride in the ritual, the precision, the routine, the knowledge that behind every satisfying sip, there stood an army of boiling kettles, aching arms, and iron wills. That, and the secret knowledge that one of the ladies had inadvertently spread lemon curd on a crumpet using the butter knife. Scandalous. As the last rays of sunlight drooped across the wallpaper, coloured like old blush and musty velvet, Annie began to descend the stairs once more. The dinner bell would ring soon, and the prep had only just begun. But for now, for one moment, everything was still. Just quiet footsteps, faint perfume still lingering in the air, and the distant murmur of clockwork life continuing upstairs as the silent empire of service rumbled gently below. Down in the kitchen, the meat was waiting. and so was roast day. There was a certain magic to the scullery after dark. By magic, of course, I mean the sort you'd find in a witch's damp pantry, where everything is vaguely sticky and most things smell like regret. The mistress and her guests had long finished their second pudding. A gooseberry fool, thank you for asking. And the house was now silent above stairs. That sort of taut hush, like everyone's holding their breath in corsets. All that remained downstairs was clean-up, which always seemed like a task designed specifically to make one dream longingly of tuberculosis. Our servant girl, let's call her Alice, because every Edwardian story should come with a touch of wonderland, was elbow deep in sudsy water, wrestling with what appeared to be an angry tureen. Tureens, by the way, are soup dishes pretending to be royal carriages. Heavy, ornate, and completely unnecessary. They were the peacocks of Edwardian dining ware. This particular one had a gilt-rim lid that squealed whenever Alice tried to pry it off, which felt personal. Behind her, the mangle gave a low groan, not unlike something one might hear in the lower circles of Dante's Inferno. It was a Victorian laundry tool still in proud use, a pair of rollers you fed wet clothes through to squeeze out the water, and possibly your will to live. Properly terrifying, it once mangled a junior footman's cuff so badly, he had to serve dinner looking like he'd narrowly survived a duel with a ferret. But I digress. Alice scraped hardened gravy from the silver spoon, her hands pink from the water, her back curved like a question mark. Most Edwardian servants suffered from what polite society termed general debility, a charming way of saying everything hurts, but you can't afford to die. It was all part of the grand theatre of service, of course. The dazzling dinner parties, glittering ballrooms, and starched linens above stairs were held up by a pyramid of aching backs and cracked knuckles below. The Edwardian house was a machine, and the scullery maid? A cog they forgot to lubricate. Still, there were small joys. Occasionally, the cook, her name was Mrs. Fudge, which feels a bit on the nose, but let's embrace it, would pass Alice a cracked scone or the heel of a crusty loaf, warmed by the range and slathered with illicit jam. These gestures were sotto voce acts of rebellion within the hierarchy. A culinary wink that said, yes, you mop the meat floor, but here, have a taste of the jammed aristocracy. Mrs. Fudge herself was a wonder of contradictions, fierce as a naval admiral, yet secretly partial to sentimental novels and soft cheeses. She claimed to have once chased a rat off the premises with a fish slice, which, it turns out, was not a euphemism. The scullery walls were soot-streaked and the windows fogged with steam, but when Alice glanced up, the flicker of gaslight caught the sheen of a copper kettle, and for a fleeting moment, it looked almost noble, like she wasn't just washing dishes. She was battling entropy, armed only with a rag and unshakable resolve. Outside, the stable boy coughed in his sleep. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked as someone visited the water closet with Victorian delicacy, and somewhere in the pantry, a mouse plotted its next daring heist, most likely involving raisins and ill-gotten crumbs. By now, Alice had moved on to polishing the brass candlesticks, which, in a delightful twist of irony, were rarely used since electricity had arrived in 1901, but were still polished out of tradition, or possibly spite. She hummed softly, not a real tune, just the kind worn into you by repetition and steam. The type of song that doesn't mind if no one listens. It fills the silence like warm stock fills a cold pan. Her thoughts drifted to the laundry hall, to cold mornings and stinging soap suds, to whispered conversations over buckets, to dreams held like contraband in aprons. Tomorrow, of course, would bring fresh challenges. A chamber pot incident, perhaps, or a petticoat emergency. But for now, there was this sleepy sanctuary of steam and silence and the peculiar comfort of routine. And somewhere at the edge of the scullery, just beyond the copper pans and cracked tiles, the soft sound of wheels on gravel. The mistress was returning early, which could only mean trouble. The morning had unfurled itself like a fresh linen sheet, cold, crisp, and entirely too early. The scullery maids were already rustling about below stairs, banging pots in what may have well been a musical protest against sleep itself. But upstairs, in the hazy realm of candle extinguishers and dressing bells, a servant girl's duties entered their most peculiar phase. The art of dressing a lady. Now, you might imagine helping someone put on clothes to be a simple affair. Perhaps even an act of gentle camaraderie, like two sisters preparing for tea. Let me stop you there. This was Edwardian England. Dressing a lady in 1908 was less like a morning routine and more like preparing a 5-layered pastry. Only the pastry was ticklish, often impatient, and encased in whale, bones. And you, poor Daisy or Edith or Mildred, had best get it right, or endure the quiet horror of a duchess sighing at you. One did not simply get dressed. One was donned, strapped, satined, petticoated, buttoned, bustled, sequined, pinned, gloved, shawled, and then finally perfumed, faintly, with just a suggestion of lavender and unspoken judgment. A servant girl's task began with what was delicately termed the laying out. This wasn't a funeral, it was worse. One had to lay out the entire ensemble before her ladyship even opened her eyes. Never mind that ladies of the gentry often change their attire up to 5 times a day. Morning dresses, walking gowns, tea frocks, carriage costumes, and the grand finale, dinner dresses, swathed in beads heavy enough to sink a modest canoe. Today, Lady Agatha Thistlethwaite had planned a promenade along the garden promenade. Yes, that's exactly as redundant as it sounds. And thus, she required her lemon linen mourning ensemble, all 21 pieces of it, including the underthings, which were as mysterious as they were exhausting. First came the chemise, a sort of ghostly undershirt that ensured no actual bodice ever felt your actual skin. Modesty was everything. Hysteria, after all, was just one warm shoulder away. Next came drawers. These were open-crotched bloomery affairs, wide enough to catch a mild crosswind, followed by woolen stockings, because nothing says I'm a lady of sophistication like itchy shins in July. Corset, of course, was next. Ah, the corset. A cruel hug from a disapproving aunt. Servants were expected to fasten these tightly, tighter than a grandmother's opinion, and skillfully, often lacing from the middle outward, while her ladyship grunted quietly through gritted teeth. Snugger, if you will, Mildred, she'd say, while hanging onto the bedpost like a gallant sailor in a tempest. Then came the corset cover, a thing that did little except preserve the delusion that something was being modestly concealed. Layered upon that came the petticoats, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, depending on the puff desired, followed by the dress itself, which often involved an alarming array of hidden hooks and buttons that seemed purposefully placed to conspire against the working class. And then, because turning one's head was apparently gauche, came the collar stiffeners, like tiny cardboard guillotines, affixed by hand and pinned with quiet dread. One memorable innovation during this era was the shirtwaist, a blouse-type garment beloved by working women and scorned by the aristocracy who wore it anyway, because Queen Mary once said it looked wholesome. So if Lady Thistlethwaite deigned to wear one, it had to be starched within an inch of sentience and tucked precisely. A millimetre too high, and Daisy might as well start packing. Gloves next, which had to be eased on with a button hook, an elegant little torture device that preyed on the narrow gaps between fingers and time. Then the shoes, buttoned, never laced, because laces were apparently too athletic. Hats were affixed with hatpins sharp enough to put the fear of God in any faint-hearted gentleman who dared linger at a flirtatious distance. A hatpin through the wrong hat and, well, there's a reason some footmen joked it doubled as a murder weapon. By the time Lady Thistlethwaite was dressed, mildly scolding the choice of brooch or shawl angle, poor Mildred or Daisy or Edith was ready for a lie-down. But there was no time for such indulgence. The parlour plants needed their misting, the letters needed sorting, and there were the luncheon napkins. Mustn't forget those. Still, as Lady Thistlethwaite glided elegantly down the stairs, unaware or perfectly aware of the symphony of labour that had sculpted her appearance, a servant girl might sneak a glance at her reflection in a polished brass candlestick, just enough to fix her cap and wonder, only a little, what it might be like to promenade in lemon linen and command the sunrise. But such thoughts are for later, when the gloves are off and the hearth is warm, and perhaps, just perhaps, one has time to dream. And speaking of dreaming, there's still yet another secret tucked into the folds of fine bone china and boiled beef. If you happen to be a servant girl in Edwardian England, and you found yourself glancing wistfully out a scullery window during your 37 seconds of mid-afternoon reflection time, you might think of fresh air as something you once heard about in a story. Stories were, after all, safer than facts, at least for the Edwardian working class, and safer still if they were whispered by the chimney and included no revolutionary ideas about weekends or wages. But now, in the deep velvet hush of pre-supper hours, you'd be preparing what the lady of the house simply called the drawing room trays, a deceptively charming phrase that suggested a touch of watercolour and soft music. But, fear not. In truth, it involved sprinting down the stone corridors of a house large enough to qualify as a minor principality, balancing ornate silver trays stacked with crystal glasses, decanters, and 4 different types of small pickled things. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bletchley, the housekeeper, was lurking somewhere, quite possibly behind a heavy velvet curtain, just in case you let your elbows flare out ungracefully during the turn past the grand staircase. She didn't tolerate any unnecessary flamboyance, not even at the elbow level. In Edwardian England, servant girls didn't just serve the upper class. They secured the illusion that nobility occurred naturally, like fog. One did not question how perfectly a fire had been laid, nor who had remembered to plump the Viscount's decorative foot-pillow. It was simply assumed the house had always known how to be charming. Behind that illusion, though, was you, rambling past oil, portraits like a silent stagehand in a very long-period drama, one that rarely acknowledged your character's name. But tonight a new ordeal awaited. The Dowager Lady Skeffington, who had played host to Queen Alexandra once and made sure everyone remembered it annually, was coming to dine. Her presence meant everything had to be what they called very correct. This meant extra starch in the footmen's collars and a maddening ritual known as decanting the sherry. Now, technically, one cannot make sherry taste better by pouring it from one fancy bottle into another, but it's quite the sport for the Edwardians. There was a silver funnel, a white linen filter, and a lot of sighing. You were not strictly allowed to sigh, but the butler, Mr. Fielding, was. In fact, sighing may have been his entire job description. Fielding would be there now, standing like a disappointed statue beside the wine cellar door, holding the decanter as though it contained diplomatic secrets. He wouldn't speak unless truly provoked, and even then, only in startling statements such as "we do not swirl claret here," or "the Queen's cousin once dined off this very service, and I will not see it sullied by fingerprints." While the upper-class women fluttered in taffeta about whether to serve oxtail soup before or after the salmon, you and the second parlour-maid Nell would be frantically attempting to light all 47 candles in the dining room. The candelabra, of course, was an emotional minefield. One had to keep the wax from dripping on the damask, which was older than electricity and infinitely less forgiving. You'd pause now and then to blow softly on a drooping taper, your face dimly glowing in the golden hush, unseen, unsung, and ever so slightly singed. Every now and then, Nell would mutter something poetic like, "If I drop the fish knives again, I'm becoming a nun." You'd nod solemnly, but your fingers would still be moving, wrapping napkins into what the lady called Balmoral folds, which looked suspiciously like triangles. Dinner service transformed the house into a low-voiced opera in starched cotton. Upstairs, Crystal clinked politely. Downstairs, someone was always sprinting with gravy. Timing was sacred. Heaven help you if the asparagus spears arrived lukewarm. And yet, despite the endless rush and obligation, a strange peace settled in beneath the bustle. There was always order in repetition, rhythm in ritual. You knew the path from larder to dining room by heart now, could sense Mrs. Bletchley before she appeared, could silently correct a wobbly place setting from 2 yards away. That invisible competence, it had a hum to it, like a lullaby no one taught you, but you'd always known the tune. And so, as the final bell rang, and the drawing room filled with laughter only slightly louder than expected, you adjusted your cuffs and stepped back into shadow. Let us now drift further, down the quiet passageways toward a place not many people dare to think about, the dreaded laundry room where linens were boiled, beaten, and bleached within an inch of their embroidered lives, all to keep appearances suitably tranquil. But that, soft one, is a tale for another hush. The year is 1909, and the wallpaper in the Tremblethorpe drawing room is suffering from a distinctly Victorian identity crisis. It's been trying to keep up with the lighter hues and floral prints of the Edwardian era, but its heavy maroon flocked pattern refuses to go quietly. Much like Lady Tremblethorpe herself, looming like an errant church organ by the fireplace, sighing loudly into her tea. Below stairs, however, things are taking a far less restful turn. It is 5:47 in the morning, the hour when only the guilt-stricken and the employed dare stir, and dear Elsie, our weary but determined servant girl, is already elbow-deep in the coal scuttle. The fire in Lady Tremblethorpe's boudoir must be lit before her ladyship's toes so much as graze the Persian rug. Coal duty, for the uninitiated, involved more than one might assume. First, one had to find where the coal had gone. Then, one had to heft it through narrow hallways and up unkind staircases, without leaving so much as a smudge on the wallpaper that refused to modernize. This, of course, while wearing a starched apron the colour of a snowdrop's soul. Lugging her small tin bucket and muttering all the while, Elsie made her way through the silent house. Every floorboard had its opinion and was eager to share it. Creak, groan, protest in G-sharp. She reached the door of the boudoir, nudged it open with the care of a mouse tiptoeing past a sleeping cat, and began the fireplace ritual. It's a ceremony familiar to the unthanked. Scrape out yesterday's cinders, arrange fresh coals artfully, and then coax flame into being like a reluctant dance partner. Across the hall, Miss Evangeline Tremblethorpe, Lady Tremblethorpe's daughter and bath enthusiast, was preparing to summon the bath girl. Elsie. Now, it's crucial to understand that bathing in Edwardian England was less get in and get clean, and more fill 15 gallons of water at wildly inappropriate temperatures, carry them in copper jugs the size of a cocker spaniel, and don't spill lest you be banished. The bathtub was not conveniently plumbed. In fact, water arrived only through a combination of kettles, muscle, timing, and prayer. Elsie, who had just finished playing Prometheus with the drawing room hearth, now received the silver bell signal from on high. Ding! The bath needed drawing. She trudged down to the scullery, where the great kettle squatted upon its iron throne, and began the boiling and lugging routine. Each trip was a small, wet act of devotion, accompanied by a slosh, a stagger, and very occasionally, a sneezed confession under her breath. While she worked, the kitchen maid, Dora, was busy turning eggs and breadcrumbs into something resembling breakfast for the hunting party scheduled to descend upstairs at 7:30. The air was thick with brisk practicality and a faint hint of toasted lard. By the time Elsie returned to the bathroom with her 7th kettleful, she was beginning to dream up a complicated plan that involved switching places with a stable boy and riding off to Ireland under an assumed name. But then, miracle of miracles, the bath was full. She whispered a little victory tune under her breath, something between a lullaby and a war cry. And just as she was about to disappear down the stairs for an hour's worth of floor scrubbing, Evangeline fluttered in with all the grace of an outraged cabbage butterfly. "Elsie, there's too much steam," she said, turning on her heel as if offended by physics itself. Lowering her head like a footman in mourning, Elsie opened the window just a crack and watched a cloud of bathtub mist escape to freedom. Downstairs again, she paused in the pantry, where the smell of freshly baked bread had begun to settle like an old friend. A glance at the clock, 6:53. Not even sunrise had bothered to clock in yet. She allowed herself a single bite of crust, pilfered with all the stealth and reverence of an ancient relic thief. Everything was temporary, including secret bread. Soon she would be brushing the front steps, a bizarre ritual in which one makes steps so clean, no one may walk on them without ruining the day. But for a moment, she stood in the hush of the pantry, surrounded by tins of custard powder and carefully labelled jam jars, each one doing its best to appear important and necessary. A knock echoed down from the main hall. The post had arrived, which meant, oh joy and jubilation, more dreadful letters, new gossip to be whispered about in corners, and, perhaps, one of those gleaming catalogues from Harrods that the upstairs ladies would flip through wistfully, never purchasing but always dreaming. The day was only beginning, and Elsie, tired though she was, squared her shoulders once more. For upstairs, the head housemaid had begun her rounds, and her shoes, entirely unlike her disposition, were very soft indeed. Let's follow those quiet footsteps, shall we? As the sun lifted its sleepy head over the domes and chimneys of Edwardian London, our dear servant girl was already awake. Or more accurately, she had never quite stopped being awake. She was a blur of black dress and pin-tucked apron, moving softly across the gaggle of creaking floorboards and perpetually under-polished brass. The house itself yawned around her. One could almost hear it say, "Oh, back again, are we?" This morning, the mistress had a luncheon. Not just any luncheon. A very important luncheon. Capital letters fully implied. A lady from Kent, 4 friends from her card society, and a cousin's governess who'd once been spoken to by someone vaguely connected to Lord Harrowby, scintillating. Now, while such an event might sound delightfully skippable to folks blessed to live in the 21st century, in 1910, it was an ordeal on par with a minor skirmish in the Balkans. For a servant, a luncheon typically meant a 12-hour panic spiral involving 6 trays of vaguely edible gelatin, a teetering asparagus tower, and keeping Lady Louisa's particularly vindictive pug from engaging in a duel with the flower arrangements. Mabel, our ever-resilient heroine, had started the day like all others, by lighting fires, emptying chamber pots, and praying to the household gods that nothing involving syllabub or aspic was on the luncheon menu. She was only partially answered. The cook, Mrs. Cornbury, stood at the kitchen work table like a general before battle, hands buried in a mound of potted shrimp. Conversation was not encouraged during pre-luncheon operations. Mabel had learned this the hard way after once inquiring with genuine, fatal curiosity why Edwardians put capers in everything. Capers are civilization, Mrs. Cornbury had declared, as if quoting ancient scripture. By mid-morning, Mabel had already made 14 ascents of the servants' staircase, each time carrying some intimidating platter or lace-trimmed bowl designed less for human consumption and more for aesthetic sabotage. The luncheon table had to look as though a rococo garden had exploded. Crystal, silver, and napkin, folding so elaborate, it deserved a knighthood. In the drawing room, Lady Culpepper was supervising the placing of cushions with the kind of intensity one usually reserves for diffusing bombs. No, the cerulean silk must be precisely 2 inches from the embroidery ridge, she said, in a voice that could wilt dahlias. 3 inches and it's a scandal. If you were wondering, yes, Edwardian cushions were political. Mabel, while balancing a tray of mincemeat canapes on one arm, recalculated the trajectory of her life. She might have been a village schoolmistress, or a circus musician, or even just someone who got to sleep until sunrise. But alas, here she was, threading between family heirlooms, praying not to sneeze near the antique wainscoting, and desperately avoiding eye contact with the portrait of Lord Ralston above the sideboard, whose expression of permanent aristocratic disappointment was particularly unhelpful. Luncheon commenced at exactly 1 o'clock because it was understood that the digestive cycle of the Edwardian upper classes was precisely timed, much like a regiment. Guests arrived stiffly, their hats clucking with feathers, their voices light and tinny, like teaspoons jangling in porcelain. Footmen glided like ghosts, polished and silent, and behind it all, like the underpinning gears of an ornate yet slightly ridiculous clock, the servants hummed with precision, mostly fueled by adrenaline and weak tea. As courses came and went, lobster moulds, veal in puff pastry, something unholy, involving cold-boiled eggs, Mabel was the silent shadow at the edge of the dining room. Her movement was expected, her speech was not. A servant girl might have been present, but she mustn't be there. Still, as the guests giggled wanly about the prince's latest party and whispered deliciously scandalous things about the vicar's niece, Mabel found a kind of rhythm in the madness. A dance among the balustrades of privilege. A turn here, a tray there, a slight lift of an eyebrow when Lady Diana asked if the fish feels tired. It did. At the end of the meal, the gentlemen retired to the salon, the ladies to the drawing room for petits fours and gossip. and the servants to the scullery for what remained of their dignity, and several pans that looked like they'd lost a fight with a jellied eel. Mabel stood at the giant zinc sink, scrubbing plates and wondering how something could simultaneously be called veal custard and be legal. But such was life, served cold, with garnish. And so went the luncheon. Hours of preparation, minutes of consumption, days of metaphorical and literal cleanup. It was hard work, invisible labor, performed so that someone else could feel important while holding a fork the correct way. Still, Mabel wiped her hands and leaned momentarily against the wall, breathing in the scent of soapsuds, overboiled ham, and a faint trace of muffins. A sound, fleeting and implausible, whispered through the airy hush of the empty corridor, the faint clink of a dropped monocle perhaps, or the endless ticking of a world that never asked what it cost to keep itself spinning, and just when it seemed the day had offered all its surprises. The doorbell rang, again, because rest in Edwardian England was a myth sold to people who already had it. But who could it be this time? By the time the week wearily rolled itself into Sunday, the servant girl's designated half-day of not quite freedom. It was less a day off and more a chance to collapse in the least embarrassing corner of the servants' quarters in hopes your corset would stop whispering cruel sonnets against your ribs. Sundays began slowly, shrouded in the sounds of less frantic footsteps and the thick, holy smell of furniture polish mingling with boiled cabbage from earlier in the week. Morning prayers were mandatory, but thankfully short. Unless, of course, the house belonged to that irksome breed of endlessly devout Edwardian employers. Those who felt their upstairs kitchen crumbs could only be expunged by earning divine favor through servant-made hymns. But Miss Eliza, our long-suffering heroine of feather dusters and chamber pots, had learned to hum her way free of most burdens. By now she could arrange a tea tray with her eyes closed, predict when the head housemaid would sneeze, and sort the post just by how judgmental the envelopes felt. She was the queen of the half-day gaze, that calm, distant expression that said, "Yes, Mrs. Townsend, I am listening," even though I'm mentally tying a bonnet onto a hedgehog and sending it down the street with your gas bill. After the morning rituals were over, the house fell into what the staff called Lord's Day Light. This meant that, for a few hours, you could almost be mistaken for a human. The starch in your apron still crackled like sheet lightning, of course, but no one expected you to play ghost pianist to silent bells or iron bootlaces into crisp militarism. If there was enough time before her brother's shirt collar fell mysteriously behind the stove again, Eliza might venture out, hatpin neatly spearing her rebellious curls, gloves gingerly thumbing a dog-eared book of poetry she never quite managed to read. Leisure time was a tight corset of its own, squeezed between obligations and the threat of spontaneous water-boiling duty. Most often, the outing led to the park, where roses bloomed like secrets nobody dared tell, and one could sit, just for a moment, on a bench that didn't need polishing. It was here that servant girls could observe genteel society in all its carefully parasoled glory. Ladies walking tiny dogs with tinier names, and gentlemen who looked as if they couldn't even spell gravy, much less ladle it. Eliza liked to watch the world go by, to catalogue the quiet absurdities that passed as properness. She once spent an entire outing watching a man lose a sandwich to a sparrow, only to pretend it was a tactical surrender. The servant girls called these pigeon matinees, free entertainment, bird inclusive. On this particular Sunday, something remarkable happened. while enjoying a scone she'd smuggled from the kitchen, a criminal act on par with licking the Queen's shoe, Eliza spotted a trio of servant girls from other households. They weren't in uniform. One even wore a coat with blue trim, which was so thrillingly improper it might as well have been lined with diamonds. They spoke softly and laughed the way people laugh when no supervisors are listening. They were free, at least for the moment. It occurred to Eliza then, somewhere between scandalized admiration and a mouthful of stolen jam, that servant girls, despite being placed firmly at the bottom of the Edwardian pyramid of existence, had carved out a quiet society of their own. A system of nods and glances, shared cigarettes behind laundry lines, and the ability to pass an entire conversation using only eyebrow tilts and a slightly exaggerated dusting motion. They were clever in ways no etiquette manual could teach. Navigators of invisible tensions, masters of vanishing from rooms the moment cologne and complaints entered. They were survival artists, choreographers of the unspoken ballet that unfolded nightly behind closed kitchen doors. But Sunday always ended. The flame of freedom fluttered, then snuffed itself politely at the tick of 4 o'clock. At home, the household would reanimate, and linen would once again demand its sacrifice. Eliza rose from her bench, the crumbs of rebellion brushed from her lap, and turned back down the path. Even the sun seemed to respect her dignity, filtering through the trees as if bowing to a woman who had once made a 4-tiered sponge cake while crying, and didn't let a single tear fall in the custard. And so, with her hatpin re-anchored and her limbs slightly less sorcerously sore, she returned to her post, where brass shone, tea steamed, and the world revolved entirely on the shoulders of women no history book would name. But rest assured, someone's stockings were about to catch fire, and Eliza would be there, calmly wielding both the tongs and the witty remark to match. Let's sink gently now, imagining the slow tick of the scullery clock, winding itself toward what may be the final curtain call. The gas lamps flickered low as the final brass pots were polished to a mirror shine. And somewhere down in the scullery, the faint clatter of a drying teacup marked the end of yet another endless day. You, dear listener, a humble servant girl in Edwardian England, had once again managed the heroic feat of surviving a Tuesday. Congratulations. You arrived in this morning with aching knees and buttons that never quite fasten properly, and you leave this evening with soot in your nails, a faint whiff of boiled cabbage behind your ear, and exactly 37 minutes of sleep ahead of you before breakfast preparations begin again. And yet, there is something oddly peaceful now in this quiet. The grand manor house is asleep, or at least pretending to be. Upstairs, the Dowager Countess is snoring with a sound that could loosen the plaster. The master's youngest son, permanently 3 years old and emotionally allergic to handkerchiefs, sleeps tangled in sheets he'll certainly soil before dawn. Even Mrs. Havisham, the cook, has taken to her cup of port and grumbled herself into slumber, dreaming, no doubt, of a pie crust that doesn't misbehave. Below stairs, you move through the silence like a ghost in petticoats. It's the only time in the day when no one is looking. No orders are rung down, no coal to shovel, no fire to stoke. Just cool stone floors beneath your feet and the hush of worn wood, old as empire. You sit, briefly and illicitly, on the edge of the wooden bench tucked beneath the scullery window. The glass is warped and speckled from decades of pea soup steam, but beyond it, the moon is patient and round. Someone once told you she watches over overworked servant girls. Likely a lie. Yet she seems appropriately sympathetic. Your hands, red from scrubbing lye and laundry soap, rest in your lap. You flex your fingers and feel the sigh of calluses forming, tiny badges of invisible labor with no ceremony and no medals to mark them. Still, there's a gentle rhythm to this life. Even misery has its patterns. Up at 4:30 a.m., pasties by 5. Bell rings by 6. Madame needs her chocolate not too hot, not too dark, with a single ginger biscuit, thank you kindly. One wrong note and you're blamed for upsetting digestion and possibly causing the downfall of the aristocracy. And yet, as you stare at the back staircase, the one you trot up so often you could do it backward while balancing a tray of kidneys on toast, you realize something strange. Despite everything, the blisters, the barking matron, the relentless polishing of brass things you're not even allowed to touch, you have survived. You've even, improbably, adapted. Because even amidst the rigidness of Edwardian order, the bowing and scraping and starched everything, you've learned a few tricks, like how to sneak an extra lump of sugar in your tea by pretending you dropped it, or how to avoid Lord Henry's wandering hands by claiming sudden interest in chamber pot cleaning. You've mastered an entire language of glances, head tilts, and murmurs, a clandestine sisterhood of housemaids and kitchen girls exchanging intelligence about who's in a mood, who's having visitors, and which footman likely filched the beef drippings. Hint, it was Alfred. It's always Alfred. Most scandalous of all, you've discovered the secret joy of sitting. Just sitting. For 3 blessed minutes when the manna finally exhales. Your life, though burdened and backbreaking, is stitched with quiet victories. And perhaps that's the real secret they never teach in finishing school or whisper in marble halls. That even in a world designed to keep you small, your spirit adapts, grows clever, and finds delight in the never-intended cracks. Now the candle burns lower. Somewhere the clock's just struck midnight. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and chamomile, the scent of 100 exhausted girls trying to snatch sleep between shifts. You slip off your shoes, they've pinched all day. You nestle into your coarse blanket, still warm from the iron plate. You sneaked from the kitchen stove and exhale. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over the rolling lawns and endless tasks. But for now, in the cool dark, you're nothing but breath and blankets and peace. The kind of peace only a servant girl at rest can truly understand. Sleep, dearest. The brass will still be tarnished in the morning.